Businesses are better together. That simple idea has been around for 400 years, but in today's economy, it may matter more than ever. Welcome back to the Mike Method. I'm your host, Mike Desjardins. Today, I'm joined by Jen Riley, President and CEO of the BC Chamber of Commerce, a leader who has spent more than 20 years helping organizations turn complexity into clarity, from global communications at EA Sports to brand and communications leadership at Bosa Properties, and now advancing the voice of business across British Columbia. In this conversation, Jen helps us understand the evolving role of chambers of commerce, why local business voices matter in shaping policy, and how storytelling can turn complicated issues like energy, trade, workforce, affordability, major projects, and Indigenous partnerships into conversations that people can actually understand. We also explore why leadership today requires curiosity, synthesis, and the ability to hold complexity without reducing everything to a binary debate. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, the best way to help us continue to grow our audience is to hit that subscribe button. Let's dive in. Jen, thanks for making time to be on the podcast.
Absolutely. My friend Mike.
I feel like we're way overdue to have a conversation on so many different topics. But the one today that we're going to dive into is about the BC Chamber of Commerce, and in particular chambers, because they've been around for a really long time. I don't even know how long. And I'd love to just sort of start there about, the history of chambers and like what their purpose is, so that people are sort of grounded, listeners are grounded in the conversation we're about to have.
Sure. So chambers of commerce, they say the early days were 400 years ago.
Okay.
And it really is around the concept that businesses are better together. When you think about businesses in a community rooted in place, before globalization, of course, there's been places forever. Businesses felt like they needed to work together, advocating for shared interests, connecting to share insights, to understand how to do that effectively. And that really is the enduring element of a chamber of commerce. And the organization that I now have the opportunity to lead is actually 148 years old. So the British Columbia Board of Trade, as it was originally incorporated, came in 1878. And if you're figuring out when that was, it's just a few years after the Confederation of our country, and BC kind of came about in 1871. So forever, essentially, and a day is really how long these have existed. But I think somewhere around the line, some of the brand awareness or what we actually do in our communities has been less known.
That's an incredible history. I had no idea it was that long. That it really at the start of the country is when there was a recognition that a chamber of commerce was necessary to help to support the birth, or not just the birth at that point, but I guess the organization of businesses to support the interests of businesses. So let's bring that forward to 2026 now. So what do you see today as the evolving role of the Chamber of Commerce?
So I, as the provincial layer of the chamber system, which also includes boards of trade and chambers of commerce are essentially the same thing. There are elements that would be different. They're largely interchangeable, but I am at the provincial level. And yes, there's a Canadian Chamber of Commerce above me. But I represent all the city, towns, and rural areas of British Columbia with 84 local chambers of commerce. And so those are rooted in place institutions where, whether it is the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade, which is quite a big enterprise here in town, but also you could be the Chetwynd Chamber of Commerce. I just got off the phone with Castlegar. Anywhere in actually Lytton, the town that unfortunately burned down, is a new member as of a week ago.
Oh, great.
One business. Yeah, one business. And how can we help them to get there? So really what I would say is the three things at the local level that a chamber does is they connect the businesses. They're sharing tools and programs, and that would be for their membership, which are local businesses or not-for-profits. And the third thing is that advocacy for shared interests. Now, I think over time, boards of trade and chambers of commerce have often been synonymous with policy and advocacy only. And it certainly is part of the work that we do, advocating to government when we don't believe our interests have been heard. But honestly, there's so much more that we can do when you really understand and listen to the needs of a business community, connect them together, and then figure out what that looks like, synthesizing it, giving that platform, and then using that at the government level to ensure that the things on the ground are not too far away from the decisions being made, right? So our understanding of what our own business communities are experiencing has a level of contribution to the provincial economy, but it's quite far away. And my job is really that liaison on how I work across the chamber network. So if we say businesses are better together. I believe chambers are better together, and we represent that collective, and we're coordinating the listening across the chambers to really understand and synthesize what is happening in our business communities, to use the gravitas of this office and the opportunity that I have to be able to translate that in real ways when I get access to government decision makers. And I also think we have a content platform to share that people are interested in the insights that we would have given the unique position that they sit in the province.
What I find fascinating too about this conversation is that, and maybe I'm not sure if listeners realize this, but like in Canada, small businesses employ more people than all of the large organizations combined. And so, but they don't have the lobbying power. So you think these large organizations, they have so many different people and vice presidents and EVPs whose job it is to go and try to advocate for changes in government policy that help to support these large organizations. But somebody who owns a restaurant or owns a couple of dry cleaners or whatever it is, right? A small business of some description doesn't have that kind of capacity. And if there's nobody speaking on their behalf, that means there's nobody speaking for the people that employ more people in Canada than anyone else. And so I'm grateful that the Chamber of Commerce exists, both from a provincial level in terms of being able to support the needs of the organizations at the provincial government level. But also there are unique issues, I'm sure, to each region and each city in British Columbia, where again, one person, one business in that city might not have a voice, but when they could get together to have, sure, there's only one person in Lytton right now, but when there's 10, 12, 20, when they start to grow their membership, now all of a sudden they'll actually get a voice to be able to help to support great policy change.
Yes, that absolutely is the concept of the collective. Okay. And, British Columbia, 98% of business in British Columbia is small and medium. I will say that if you take a look at our membership, it is all sectors and all sizes. So we still also are here representing the biggest businesses in our markets. And it really just depends what that market has in it. So let me use a small example of a town, Kitimat. Kitimat's, most of its business community is small, but it also happens to be where LNG Canada is today. Right. So suddenly it has interests from much larger companies, and with the major projects office of the federal government in town looking at another phase of a liquid natural gas facility, suddenly it's not small but big. Another example would be Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, is one of our corporate partners. They have branches in 150 towns and cities, and certainly they're doing corporate lendings at scale. And they represent the rooted in place institutions that we are too. Right. So it's a really good partnership. And so we certainly are listening and synthesizing what's happening in business communities, but it really is all sectors and all sizes. And that's the other differentiator is I think if we're talking about why chambers or boards of trade have not always been as popular, the first choice is, I think in an industry, you'd be a member of a sector association. So if you're in real estate, you might be a member of what's here in British Columbia, the Urban Development Institute, UDI. If you are in forestry, it might be COFI around the forest industry. So this is the one place where it's cross-sectoral and it's meant to be synthesizing. And we are definitely finding interesting alignment in regions around the province. Workforce challenges that might happen in northern rural areas that use a lot of short-term immigration, hopefully with more permanent residency, is also a similar problem for resort communities. Tofino and Whistler would actually have the same challenge as Fort Nelson. And they would not otherwise know that we can take a look at the same challenge and advocate both to the provincial and federal government and just tell stories. To be honest, that's the other thing, is not only can I advocate, but I can also just bring light on what's happening out there, right? Which is another service I think that we're providing at the provincial level, is just the understanding of what is happening on the ground in business communities. So it's small and medium, but it's also very, very large. And you would expect the full spectrum, whether they're directly members of the provincial chamber or they're members of a chamber or a board of trade, for example. Greater Vancouver Board of Trade is 5,500 members. And that excellent organization just hosted a curated conversation with Mark Carney, our prime minister, last week. So certainly seeing different levels of scale from the one business in Lytton to essentially the center of our economy here in Vancouver.
And that's great learning for me too, to understand that it is really not just cross sector, but across all sizes of enterprise and business across Canada. I love that you bring up this concept of narrative because, I mean, that's been the story of your career personally too. I mean, maybe share with listeners a little bit more about your background of storytelling, because it's been building brands has been at the root of what you've done in your career, and I know there's a lot of that has to do with narrative.
It's an interesting segue, and I'm happy to move in this direction. I will offer that when the selection committee started the discussion with me about taking the president and CEO role of the BC Chamber of Commerce, you might expect someone with brand marketing and communications experience would feel quite a bit of imposter syndrome. The turning, like, who me? Especially that while I have been policy adjacent and have some understanding of how the work that I've done in my past corporate roles, most notably at probably Electronic Arts or EA Sports, a global video game or technology company here in Vancouver, certainly policy adjacent, but not the center point of the work. Right. And in those roles, essentially, if you boil down what a communicator, a brand person, or a marketer does, is just, what are we building? Who wants it? How do we tell people about it? Where do we say those things? And then how do you do that in a way that's bringing hearts and minds in the direction you want them to go, which is pretty universal. So when the hiring committee brought this forward, I honestly first Googled BC Chamber of Commerce, which demonstrated to me that we had some
branding opportunity.
And that has less to do with the BC Chamber of Commerce and more to do where I had been in the sphere in British Columbia, working in more of a globally focused organization for a long time. And I just saw the opportunity as one that I could take the same approach that I would have taken in another business. And, when I looked at this, I said, okay, well, what is the chamber? Just like you asked me. Yeah. What's the role that we're playing at the local level? What's the role at the provincial? And then are they buying what I'm selling? And while right. we're a not-for-profit, we have a mission that we have work to do. And I want to scale that up to be able to support the growth of the provincial economy. And that's a great story. So certainly felt open to hearing more and, the opportunity of finding lots of different ways to speak about what we were selling in the past. And now I get to do it about something that to me is really interesting. My curiosity has been on fire in the first 120 plus days in this role, learning about every sector and being able to ask the questions of my leaders and community, like, why does that matter? Tell me more. I don't know this yet. So let me use my beginner's mindset to understand the thing you're teaching me so we together can get after it, tell the story. And hopefully if change needs to happen at the government level, I can support that. Yeah.
There's as we're having this conversation, it reminds me, so back in 2002, which is 24 years ago, there was this oil tanker that was, this is a piece about narrative, right? There's this oil tanker that was to be abandoned in rough seas. It lost power and they rescued the crew, but there was a dog that was left there. And a lot of people were like, well, there's a dog left. And so that's unfortunate. But what they did was crew actually got the name of the dog, which was, I think it was Foggett, and a picture of the dog out into the media and said, this is the dog that's stranded. $115,000 rescue to go, and the Coast Guard to be able to go and get that dog helicoptered off the, when they had to find the dog, but get the dog off the oil tanker and brought back. And this has been touted as a story about the power of narrative, where, you put a picture and a name to the dog, and all of a sudden it goes from, oh, that's too bad about the dog, to we will do anything to get the dog back. Because now it's not just a dog, it's the dog with the photo and there's a story behind the dog, and they're like, we are rescuing that dog. So similarly here, you're in this position where there's so many incredible stories across British Columbia of businesses and what they're trying to accomplish and what we're trying to do with the economy. And the more, I guess, you can personalize that for the people that are in government, so that they then, when they're telling the story of why they're making a change in legislation, they then have stories they can tell their constituents, which are much better than we decided to do a policy change because we think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. And that is really, I'm in my 120 or some odd days. The original ask when I was brought in for this role is we are delayed on a strat plan. Okay. And I'm actually speaking to you as we have just been able to move that forward. So I'm happy we were able to move quickly, but we were able to move quickly because it was so clear on really what we are here to do and the opportunity in front of us. And people don't often think content, narrative, policy, advocacy. But at the end of the day, as you said, government are people. And while we're trying to change the policy or whatever it is, we also have to change the tide around that. And all the people reading the media and what people are saying at dinner parties, that is absolutely influencing the output here, right? So sure. The fact that I can break down all of these amazing stories, and a story could be, I am Tiffany, the chamber leader in Fort St. John, and we are having struggles with our workforce. More than anything, we would love immigration to support our workforce with longstanding, but right now we have an acute challenge. And the temporary foreign worker policy, can we get an opt-in? And then there was a story about a certain business, and that certain business didn't have what they needed. That ends up in the press, a quick little text to a minister, and we're able to move that forward. But the humanizing of a consultation with Tiffany from Fort St. John and Bev from Fort Nelson and some of the others really helped to bring that over the line. And then, that's one example of a small policy. I also think most of us don't understand what's going on in the world. And I mean that with love. And as a person who's been reading the paper every day for years, and I am astonished on how much I have learned, mostly in this particular province, because that's where I'm focused, but I think this is applicable to anyone listening for wherever they are. And if we could only humanize some of the things happening around us in a way that we could understand, and not in a pedantic way, but in a way that it just makes sense, we probably would get farther. And in British Columbia right now, if you've read the paper in the last week or so, certainly we are having a moment around energy, and energy, whether it's clean, what the role of major projects in our province. We have a lot of the natural resource of gas, right, that we have an opportunity to leverage, but we also have a resource around hydroelectricity. How do we think about this? Last week, Vancouver City Council has opened back up a building code to bring natural gas back in. You've heard our Prime Minister say we also need to change our electricity grid and up that by 2050. And really, electricity is energy that we create to be able to make things work, right? But I didn't know, as a British Columbian, that our hydroelectricity, for example, that is 90% of our electricity grid that we create. But did you know, and now I do, that if you take out transportation fuels, the actual energy consumption to power major projects and industrial places, 50% is still natural gas. Yeah. Because electricity is not energy. That is a story I'm telling you that most people don't know. And it doesn't have a lean to it. It has information. And I imagine if people had information they could access in a way that they understood, it might change the way they're thinking about some of the choices they make. Whether that is, who you're voting for in your election, or really what you're feeling around what can be binary, climate change versus the economy. It doesn't have to be binary. And so storytelling around the energy picture will be work that we do for the next year. And we just want to humanize it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I think what's fascinating too is like LNG. I think people think of like LNG as, okay, so they're pulling gas out of liquefied natural gas out of the ground, or, shipping it elsewhere. That's the end of the story, right? That's it. But the reality is that LNG plants are net producers of electricity once they get up and running. And so they require electricity to get them up and running. But once they start producing, they produce their own electricity. And so it's kind of like the story out of Sweden, right? So there's this interesting thing that Sweden has just figured out, which is that it had a garbage and a recycling issue. So like we have all this recycling and we don't know where to put it. And what happens with most garbage in, at least in North America, it gets buried in the ground. That's what a landfill is. So it happens in Hawaii too. Hawaii has massive landfills because where are you going to take all the garbage? It's an island in the middle of the Pacific, right? Sweden was like, we've looked at the externalities of moving around garbage and moving around recycling. And what they figured out is if they burned the recycling and the garbage, they could heat water, which would spin a turbine, and they could create electricity. Now, of course, people are like, well, that's terrible. You can't burn garbage and recycling. Well, what about the carbon? Actually, there's technology to take the carbon out of that. So they're like, we actually can take the carbon out and we can make things out of carbon. Like that's easy to do. So now they ran into a problem that these large incinerators, they work at a very high temperature and they have to be kept at that temperature to create the steam, to create the electricity. They ran out of garbage and recycling. So Sweden is now a net importer of garbage and recycling from its neighbors because they realize that the actual cost of moving the recycling around and the energy that was required, the fuel that was required to move it, made zero sense. And if you burn it and create electricity and capture the carbon, that's a net better effect for the environment. But if you didn't know the whole story I just told you and said Sweden's decided to burn its recycling, that narrative is terrible. Yeah. And I think that's where, in a lot of cases, when there isn't a collective coming together that feels neutral, like I think an industry publishing something can sometimes feel like, okay, well, it's industry PR. But when a chamber comes out and says it, all of a sudden now it's like, no, this is just good for the population overall. I think it's not just the narrative, it's who's behind the narrative that I think can really change things.
And that absolutely is one of the opportunities that I think we can offer is how can we be a convener and a facilitator of conversation? And I think we can do that in a really measured way. And, the energy conversation being core among them. And in fact, I'm hosting a panel at our AGM and conference, which will have BC Hydro. BC Hydro is our crown corporation here in British Columbia. That is how we produce electricity in most of our electricity grid, 90% through hydroelectricity. Aren't we so blessed in this market? Fortis, which is a domestic gas distributor, which would be doing natural gas in your homes, the same for businesses.
And they're electric. And electric too.
And electric, and some they run the electric grid in certain areas as well. So it's another they are the BC Hydro, if you will, in some as a utility provider in some places. Enbridge, which is the big pipelines, and yes, Enbridge is all across North America with all different kinds. I'm certainly not an expert in that, but they also have a natural gas pipeline that is really the spine of it here in British Columbia. And then Tourmaline, which is a company you may not have heard of it, but it's a gas producer where they're in. They do a lot of work in BC, taking the gas out of the ground. Yep. You might think they may not all want to sit together, right? But that is not the case because we're having a discussion, not a debate, on how does it work. And, often when you think, what are the trade-offs we're making? Is it, or is there affordability for businesses and consumers around energy? Because we all use the energy for many different things, different kinds of energy for different things as well. I mean, a hospital, for example, could use electricity for most of its operations, and they could use gas for, and I'm going to blow it in what they use it, but they use gas for things that need more heat. Same for an industrial plant. You might have both, coupling. So affordability, climate, economic growth, energy security. Like, how do we think about all of those things at the same time? What is having it all? And there's a lot of opinions on this topic. Wild.
Well, it's interesting too, because I think one of the big debates that happened and I think it was Pierre Poilievre that brought this up, is he says, Canada is one of the only nations that doesn't have a strategic oil and gas reserve. And it's like, yeah, because we're a net exporter, we have too much of it already, whereas the US needs to have a strategic energy reserve for situations like the one they're in right now. We don't, because we're actually an exporter, and so we have more than enough resources, as it turns out, in Canada. Before, if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, why are the two of you so big on gas and electricity and whatever LNG? To be super clear, like my company is Virtus, is a B Corp, so we're a climate smart certified company. So I am all for. We're a target to 2030 for net carbon neutral. So at the same time, we have energy clients as well. So we're sort of seeing both sides of the coin and trying to understand, as you say, the issues are way more complex than just a simple like for or against. And I think the more time that you spend in these spaces, understanding all the sides of the issue, the more it becomes, oh, this is not binary. This is not a yes or no. This is actually quite complex. And we do need to be having this conversation, and we need to be having this conversation out loud, because the media loves it bleeds, it reads, and they're quite happy to polarize an issue because it creates press and it gets readers, but it gives you like a really distorted view of what is a very complex thing to understand. And I know you, obviously hosting a panel, already understand the complexity of it.
I'm learning. I mean, and I think you're asking, the role of narrative. I mean, I think deep curiosity is as a strong part of me, and I've used that in all of the roles that I've had. I just get to use it on something cooler that perhaps can help more in this new role. So, my curiosity, I've been really approaching a lot of the conversations with very smart people who know these things very well to inform me. But if I can't understand it, I can't translate it. So if I'm using myself as the first layer of defense on, and the consultation that I've had the opportunity to participate in, honestly, mostly through the lens of curiosity, issues like energy production in our community. The same could be said for, the difficulty reckoning we're having right now with First Nations and reconciliation around the DRIPA challenge. That is an area that we also are very uniquely positioned to participate in a difficult construct.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been lucky to be able to, I certainly don't feel confident in my ability, but I can ask the right questions to be able to facilitate and convene the discussions that need to be had.
So outside of energy and energy independence in our province and DRIPA, which is obviously a huge hot topic right now for personal property rights, and how poorly the narrative has been constructed and described. And yeah, I mean, that's like a powder keg. I would not want to be going into an election with that hanging around my head. I'm curious what other issues are coming up for the province that you're seeing right now, that you're hearing from the business community that we really need to have a deeper conversation about.
First, what I might offer as someone who just says, I like narrative and I want people to understand, DRIPA, folks, is a piece of legislation we have in British Columbia, just in case this is used an acronym. It's a piece of legislation from 2019 here in British Columbia that essentially the UNDRIP, United Nations Declarations of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, into law. And we are a place in British Columbia that's what DRIPA is, before I've gone too far and lost some of the audience here. So what I would say, and we at the British Columbia Chamber of Commerce undertake a process that the Canadian Chamber of Commerce does as well, the level above us, where every year all of our local chambers have the opportunity to bring resolutions or positions, things that they believe need to change from a government perspective, to the table. They go through a process and then they all vote and adopt on which policies we together feel like are representing the needs of the British Columbia Chamber of Commerce. So, and we're about to embark upon that in the next week or so to get the 39 or so policies that we bring forward per year. Now that is an example of a lot of micro, right? And so sometimes you end up hearing things that matter in small places that may not be the major issue. However, they can be important community to community. So there's certain things like we've had a recent win on nasal naloxone now being distributed more effectively. That was one. Daylight savings time was a policy we had on our books. These were more small policies. When I took a look at the resolution book that I have from this year, the year before, and the year before, and just tried to think about the themes, I saw a lot around workforce around British Columbia, which depending on where you are, it's just, is there enough people to do the right jobs? And there's lots of ways that comes through in policy. So I would say workforce. We've seen a lot around trade. And it's interesting if you go back a couple of years, because trade, I think, we've been talking bilaterally of late, given our relationships with our southern neighbors of the United States of America. But there's actually a lot of work on the interprovincial trade challenges that we are noting, and the need now for us to be able to have more trade routes, given I think the concerns we're having on the relationship of our biggest trading partner to the south. So trade is one that's come up in a whole bunch of different areas. Honestly, affordability. So taxation often is one of the areas. I can tell you the recent British Columbia budget, one of the hot topics around PST, where there was a provincial sales tax that was added to services. And just for context, in the past, our provincial government did not get any taxation on a service. And the ones that in question were accounting, engineering, and architectural services, security services. 7% added on, which is not one that you can quote right off, which is not the right word, but it's the best way for me to explain it.
Yes.
It's a tax on tax.
Right.
That PST that's a load of bricks for most of the business community, because it really is affecting many, many people. So affordability. And then I think the one that is rearing its head right now is the economic opportunities of our province around these major projects. Some of them are energy. How are we making them happen fast enough? And that's also probably coming because I'm representing places around the province that exist because of the one major project. We didn't speak in the tragedy of Tumbler Ridge, an area with the Chamber of Commerce. That is a town that exists because of a mine in the 90s, right? So it's so interesting how these major projects both can provide economic prosperity for a province and they create business communities amongst themselves. So major projects, getting those done, understanding, and even a major project, if I give one that is currently in the British Columbia government's strategy and the Major Projects Office of our federal government, is the North Coast Transmission Line. You may never have heard of that. That's basically the line of transmission for electricity across the top of our province from, I think it's Prince George, out to around Kitimat. I think they want to take it up as well. Might be wrong. Don't quote me all the way. It's not big enough. We need more power because we can't make mines. We can't make, and the mines, by the way, for copper is how you make wind turbines. So there's a circular economy of all these things. And that transmission line, they need to twin it to get enough energy or electricity out to power these things. And then they need to find essentially the same as an extension cord to any of those major projects. So there's such a ripple effect when those things happen for our province. So those would be my four. Did I say four? Workforce, affordability via taxes, trade, and I would say major projects. And the one that's foundational, that's underpinning all of them, that is very unique to British Columbia, I would say, is the role that our deep relationships with our Indigenous partners have as a foundational element to so much of the work we do. British Columbia is a province that has 90 to 95% unceded territories, where that means we don't have treaties in most of our province, which is not the same as the rest of Canada. And that gives us a very different environment for us to work with, as we are in deep partnership and have requirements to get around a table. And I will tell you, the chambers of commerce in local cities and towns often are the first places to have those facilitated and convening conversations in markets with the nation that they share land with. So I would say that's my fifth, because it's the underpinning of everything. And probably the area that I'm learning the most with the most speed. And it's probably where I'll spend a lot more of my time learning as well.
What I found fascinating in our time we did a lot of work with BC Hydro and leadership development. And one of the things that I learned while we were there is the complexity of these transmission lines, that when they decide they need power somewhere and they recognize they've got to put up the high powered lines, they are looking and saying, well, we're crossing over unceded territory. We're crossing over this many rivers that are salmon spawning rivers. We are going through what potentially could be an old growth forest. And so it's not like they can just draw a straight line and say, yep, we're going to run the wires this way. Oh, there's mountains and valleys in the way. There's migratory bird patterns that can be affected. So it's not like they just decide they're going to run some wires and they get the cable out and go. It's in some cases, it's a 25-year outlook that they're planning the strategy for where power needs to be. Similar to things like the Site C Dam, where, if they're going to dam a major river and effectively they create a lake on the other side, that is, and people say, well, we have enough power. And they're like, right now, we don't have enough power to continue to support industry, which is a major user of power in British Columbia. And as much as everybody can be power smart and turn their lights off and do everything else, it pales in comparison to the reality of what industry requires from a power perspective. And then it's not just that industry requires it, but as you say, it's like the power has to be in the place where the thing is. So if you're building a new mine or dam or not dam, but like you're building a new smelter or whatever it happens to be, you're trying to start a new community, the power has to be there. The ability to move that power around the province is, again, one of these things that if you're in the downtown core of Vancouver, you don't really think of, because we've got our entire infrastructure buried underground. You don't even see it anymore. They've completely hidden away all of the power infrastructure that really runs everything we see. Whereas in northern communities, they require on these high tension lines to be pulling the power from wherever the source of the power is, a dam, for instance, up to that community. And if it's not there, there's a lot of planning that goes into place, and a lot of different people are potentially affected, both positively and potentially negatively, and the environment is affected as well.
That is, it's like we talked about this in advance, which we did not, Mike, but I'm actually going to Site C Dam next week because I'm in Fort St. John. Yeah. And so Site C Dam, for those that are not aware, it was the last major infrastructure project from a BC Hydro perspective, because we have this amazing opportunity with the the amount of water we have in the mountains and being able to dam that and make the reservoirs is how we basically have more of a control system in British Columbia to turn it on and off. Amazing.
Right.
So Site C, in terms of, and this is how I'm starting to bring this together in my panel, is I don't know the megawatt gigajoule. I don't even know what the thing is, but I know it can power 500,000 homes.
Yeah.
For that one thing. Did you know a data center, depending on its size, and they can be big and small, but a data center that's probably 1 or 2 data centers is 500,000 homes. With AI changing, that is going to require a lot of power as well. An industrial project, because you need to plug in for that. That's maybe 2 or 3 of those. So it's the question of there's a yes and somewhere. And there's been a call for power from BC Hydro, and they're absolutely looking at all these new ways. I believe it was 10 projects in 2024. Another couple have just been announced. And in those 10 projects, if you're doing wind as another way of producing clean energy, that could get you to another 500,000. But it's going to take us some time to get to that. And the other thing is a lot of the world isn't powered by electricity, because you need natural gas or another source to get to a level of heat that enables these processes. So that's just another thing altogether, is it's used differently.
Yeah.
In other ways. So aren't we so lucky that British Columbia has hydroelectricity across the country? It can be debated. I've seen mostly from the Canada's energy regulator, 60% of our country is hydroelectricity. I've seen a different number recently, so call it close enough. But that is not where our neighbors to the south are, with 6% hydroelectricity. And you take a look around the world, we're in this amazing opportunity to both power the world with clean, renewable energy, and we still have a resource in natural gas that, when exported as LNG, could be positively contributing to global climate goals when it is displacing another energy like coal, which is what you're seeing in other territories. Well, I've gone very deep on the energy conversation here. You said Site C, I said I'm going. And I hope that, if you take this right back to the beginning of the conversation, you asked about narrative. Yeah. And what I'm seeking to do is understand something this complex and talk about it in a way that people can understand, right? And I'm not all the way there, but that's what I'm learning. So my learning was more for myself. If I can't explain it in a way that, and we used, can you explain it to anyone on the street? Could you, without any understanding of what we're talking about? And if you've done it and they're able to say, okay, good, interesting, I get it. And then off to make their own decisions with that information. So,
well, and I think that's the thing, right? Like you're going to these communities and actually learning what's actually happening. You're learning what industry, what businesses, because of course, anytime you put an industry into a town, right? As you said, like without Alcan, I don't think there'd be a Kitimat. Without the mine, there wouldn't be a Tumbler Ridge, right? Like all of these places are there and have these wonderful, vibrant communities as a result of an industry popping up. Well, then on top of it, you need all the goods and services. So then you get all the entrepreneurs going in and opening up the restaurants and the cafes and the dry cleaners and all the things, the bakeries, the restaurants, like everything you need to be able to support those communities. It means that homes need to be built. So that means that contractors and construction workers are getting jobs. But all these things, they all don't happen in a vacuum, right? They're all connected together. And I think your ability to be able to go around the province and understand how these things are all connected together. Because I think, there was a protest this past weekend downtown Vancouver about the 2 data centers that are getting put into place. And as you said, you can power 2 data centers or 500,000 homes. Yeah, they use a lot of energy. Okay, so in the States, what happened when there wasn't enough energy is Elon Musk decided to open up a couple of data centers in Texas, and there wasn't enough power to power them. So he's like, okay, there is access to methane. So we're going to throw in methane generators, which are not good for the environment or people's health. And they put them in traditionally communities that are underrepresented as well. And so, we definitely don't want that in British Columbia, right? We want to make sure that if we're bringing in industry, we're using power that is as clean as possible to help to protect our environment, right? Well, it goes the other way in other places in the world. And, I think that people might be worried about that happening, but here it's like, well, no, we actually have wind, we've got solar, we've got hydroelectricity drives most of the province. So we have access to it, and we're building more energy resources that are positive energy resources in the province. And I mean, yeah, it does feel like we spend a lot of time today talking about energy, but it kind of like connects into everything that's going on. And yeah, what else do we need to know, Jen? Like, what else haven't we covered that if you were listening to this and you'd never heard about the BC Chamber of Commerce before, and you were thinking, okay, like I understand like the big things that are going on in our province. I understand what its reason for being is. I understand how long it's been around and how long it's been necessary. Like, as you forecast for the future, what else do people need to know about the chamber?
Honestly, I would say, how do we take the microcosm of my Chamber of Commerce and then spread that out to those listening in wherever they are in the world? Because chambers of commerce do not just exist here, they exist everywhere.
Sure.
And I think the fact that there are folks facilitating conversations that have to be had in the community that you live in, and deeply understanding the idiosyncrasies and the integrated nature of that business community, and helping to give it what it needs to succeed, whether it's in British Columbia or elsewhere, because we all have our own unique challenges. And I think that the enduring fact that businesses are better together, it does not go away. And perhaps we lost our connection to the role that these organizations can play in your own market. But I would encourage the phone call to the Board of Trade or Chamber of Commerce near you, and to see how you can participate, both as someone that is taking the information that can be given, but also giving to the community your expertise or the resources of your own organization. I think we'd all be better off, hopefully, if people realize that being connected to those around you get you towards more of the stuff we want to go to in our lives. So reach out to your Chamber of Commerce and your Board of Trade.
I love it. Jen, thank you so much for making time to be on the podcast today.
Thank you.